January 1945. The Ardennes forest lay smothered under a sheet of ice, the trees standing like frozen sentries in a war that refused to pause. A line of German prisoners, gaunt and silent, shuffled through the snow under the watch of American MPs. Their uniforms were torn, their faces hollow from weeks of fighting with little more than frozen bread and thin broth to sustain them. From beyond a small ridge, a strange sound drifted through the cold air. The metallic clatter of lids, the hiss of burners, and then a smell, rich, unmistakable, cooked meat. One of the prisoners lifted his head, nostrils flaring in disbelief. Another sniffed the air like a starving animal. Steam curled into the freezing wind as American soldiers filed past carrying metal trays loaded with thick cuts of steak, buttered potatoes, and mugs of black coffee that sent trails of warmth into the sky. The Germans slowed, their eyes fixed not on rifles or tanks, but on food. Real food, hot food, one whispered under his breath, voice cracking in confusion. Das ist unmöglich. This is impossible. To understand how such a moment could exist in the middle of Europe's coldest battlefield, we must first step back and see how two armies prepared their men for war. War has always been a contest of firepower, territory, and endurance. But endurance is not born solely from courage or ideology. It is sustained by something far more ordinary: food. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, every major army entered the conflict with its own philosophy on how to feed men at the front. Some saw rations as a bare necessity, just enough to prevent collapse. Others, quietly and methodically, treated every meal as a weapon. For the German Wehrmacht, early victories in Poland and France had created an image of unstoppable precision. Yet behind the mechanized columns and marching infantry was a ration system built on austerity. German field units were issued Eiserne portion, the iron ration, consisting of a small tin of meat, hard bread, and ersatz, a bitter coffee substitute made from roasted barley or acorns. It was designed to keep a soldier alive, not to keep him comfortable. The German doctrine believed speed and aggression would win wars before prolonged supply became an issue. Across the Atlantic, the United States held a different view. American military planners had studied the horrors of trench starvation in the First World War. They knew that a soldier's morale could fracture not from bullets, but from hunger. By 1940, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps had already begun experimenting with caloric density, shelf stability, and psychological comfort. For them, food wasn't just nourishment, it was a message that said, you are valued. You are supplied. You will not be abandoned out here. At the outbreak of the war, the U.S. introduced a classification system for rations designed to match conditions in the field. C rations for combat patrols, K rations for airborne and assault troops, and B rations reserved specifically for field kitchens, hot meals, cooked close to the front and distributed under active combat conditions, each one meticulously calculated: proteins to maintain muscle under stress, fats to sustain body heat in cold campaigns, and sugar to shock the nervous system back into alertness after battle. Germany relied heavily on requisitioning from local populations, a practice that initially boosted supply during rapid offensives but soon turned into a liability. As the war dragged into the Soviet Union and later into Western Europe, local resources were either destroyed, evacuated, or simply insufficient to feed an army stretched across thousands of kilometers. Thin soups made from scavenged vegetables and horse meat became common, especially during winter campaigns. In contrast, American logistics functioned like a circulating bloodstream. Trains, trucks, and Liberty ships moved in rhythm. From Midwestern cattle yards to European ports, from canning factories to frontline field units, the U.S. supply chain became a relentless pipeline. A single American infantry division consumed over 700,000 pounds of food per month, and military planners made sure it arrived, even if it meant building temporary rail lines through mud or flying crates of rations under enemy fire. To the German command, this level of consumption seemed excessive, even decadent. A Wehrmacht officer once wrote, "The Americans waste more on one meal than some of our men will see in a week." It was not just sustenance, it was a psychological barrier, invisible yet crushing. A German soldier ate to survive. An American soldier ate to fight. By the time U.S. forces landed in North Africa in 1942, they brought with them not just tanks and artillery but rolling field kitchens, Compact, furnace-equipped trailers capable of producing 10,000 hot meals per day, just miles from active fighting. They ran on gasoline, used lightweight aluminum cookware, and could be set up in under 20 minutes. To a German infantryman surviving on cold bread and substitute coffee, the idea of steak and real coffee on the battlefield sounded like Allied propaganda, until the day they saw it themselves. This contrast in philosophy did not happen by accident. It was rooted in national industry, agricultural surplus, and a cultural expectation that even in war, the American soldier should not be denied basic dignity. For the German soldier, hardship was expected. For the American, hardship was something to be answered with engineering. As the conflict deepened, these two doctrines, austerity versus abundance, would collide on the frozen battlefields of Europe. Long before American troops set foot in Europe, decisions made during the Great Depression shaped how the United States would feed its soldiers in the next great conflict. The economic turmoil of the 1930s had forced the government to reevaluate national food production and distribution. Massive agricultural surpluses, particularly in grain, beef, and dairy, prompted investment in food preservation research. Universities and government agencies began studying calorie retention, protein degradation, and the psychological effects of meal quality on labor productivity. These studies, originally intended to aid struggling communities and industrial workers, would later become the backbone of U.S. military ration doctrine. When war loomed, the Quartermaster Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago began converting civilian nutrition science into battlefield survival strategy. They designed meals not only to be portable, but to improve combat effectiveness by stabilizing blood sugar and reducing fatigue. Soldiers were not just numbers in a supply list. They were biological engines, and engines needed fuel. At the same time, the United States harnessed its vast industrial base. Food production lines that once packaged canned beans for grocery stores were retooled to seal high-protein meat portions for combat rations. Assembly lines that once produced kitchen stoves were converted to manufacture portable field burners, capable of functioning in mud, snow, and rain. This adaptability meant that when mobilization began, the U.S. Army didn't struggle to improvise. It simply redirected an already massive food production machine. Germany, by contrast, entered the war with calculated ration strategies, but without the same agricultural depth. The Reich food estate centralized control, rationing bread, meat, and fats not just for civilians but for the military. Ersatz products, substitutes made from chicory, acorn, or potato starch, became common not because of innovation but necessity. Coffee was replaced. Butter was replaced. Even chocolate was replaced. Where Americans fortified rations with vitamins and sugars for combat performance, Germans issued stretch rations, deliberately diluted to extend supply lines. The doctrine prioritized frontline offensives, assuming that rapid victories would solve food shortages by capturing enemy supplies. It worked in 1940. It failed by 1943. The contrast became most visible in North Africa and Italy. U.S. field kitchens followed close behind advancing rifle companies, setting up hot meal stations even under artillery threat. German and Italian units operating with extended supply lines and insufficient fuel reserves often resorted to slaughtering livestock or boiling canned soup over makeshift fires. It was during this period that captured Axis soldiers first reported their astonishment at American food logistics. Interrogation reports recorded one Italian officer saying, "Your soldiers eat like officers. Our officers eat like prisoners." American doctrine went beyond feeding. It rotated units off the line just long enough to receive hot rations. Even a single hot meal could restore morale for days. Studies later showed that combat units receiving regular hot rations had 35% fewer exhaustion-related collapses compared to units surviving on cold packs alone. But to transport hot meals, you needed mobility, fuel organization, and trust that the supply line would hold. The U.S. Army invested heavily in GMC CCKW trucks, the iconic deuce and a half, not just for ammunition, but specifically for field kitchen mobility. The trucks carried burners, kettles, insulated coffee containers, and spice tins, because planners believed that seasoning increased food consumption and therefore calorie intake. This level of detail was unprecedented in military logistics. Meanwhile, German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned to ration even water. Their diaries spoke of days where they melted snow just to fill canteens. Ersatz coffee, a bitter black liquid made from scorched barley, did little to warm morale in negative 30-degree wind. They marched hungry, because doctrine said speed mattered more than stew. The U.S. Army believed the opposite, that a well-fed soldier would move faster in the long run than a starving one sprinty. Into exhaustion. As winter tightened around Europe and the Allied front lines stretched from Normandy to the Ardennes, this difference in doctrine would become painfully clear, especially to the German infantrymen who would soon find themselves standing in line. Not for ammunition, but for their first taste of American rations. Battles are not always won by the side with the most ammunition. Sometimes they are won by the side that still believes tomorrow is worth fighting for, in the mud, in the freezing forests, in the endless wait between artillery barrages. What kept soldiers grounded was not just discipline. It was the reminder that they were still human. American command understood something profound. A hot meal was a message. When a soldier stepped away from the line and held a steaming tray of stew, it told him that his army had not forgotten him, that somewhere behind the horizon supply lines still ran, that the machine was still functioning and he was part of it. German accounts captured this contrast. Letters recovered from fallen Wehrmacht troops spoke with bitterness of thin soup and frozen bread. One wrote, "We fight like wolves but eat like beggars." Meanwhile, American infantrymen, even in the harshest campaigns, were rotated to field kitchens whenever possible. Warmth, taste, and routine, small things, created psychological armor far stronger than any steel helmet. Military psychologists later confirmed that soldiers given consistent hot meals showed higher resilience under fire, lower rates of desertion, and improved alertness during night operations. Food delivered with consistency and warmth became a weapon, silent but devastating. Behind every tray of hot food was not just a cook, but a piece of American industrial warfare. The M1937 field range, later upgraded to the M1941 mobile kitchen trailer, was not just a stove. It was a self-contained food production system capable of feeding 200 men per meal, using gasoline burners, collapsible racks, windshields, and insulated containers that could retain heat for hours under sub-zero temperatures. The trailer could be towed by a jeep, set up in rough terrain, and operational in under 30 minutes. It could bake bread, boil coffee, fry meat, and even make gravy. A small detail, but one that mattered deeply to soldiers longing for the taste of home. German forces had field kitchens too, known as Gulaschkanone, the goulash cannon. These large soup kettles mounted on wagons had fed German troops since World War I, but they were slow, horse-drawn in many cases, and vulnerable to modern warfare's mobility. When Blitzkrieg began, kitchens often lagged behind, leaving frontline troops to eat cold preserved rations for days. American mobile kitchens, fueled by gasoline and standardized parts, kept up with armored divisions. Mechanics could replace burners in minutes. Spare parts were packed with each unit. Even coffee urns were engineered to withstand shrapnel and rough transport. It was logistics with the precision of artillery fire. To put steak and coffee in a soldier's hands in Belgium in the dead of winter was not luck. It was a logistical masterpiece. American supply chains spanned continents, moving with the rhythm of industrial strength. Cattle were slaughtered in Chicago, flash-frozen, sealed, and shipped in refrigerated containers across the Atlantic, through U-boat-infested waters, unloaded in ports like Cherbourg, and then driven by convoy to temporary depots behind the lines. Every link had redundancy. If a port was bombed, food rerouted. If a road was blocked, engineers cleared it. The mission was not just to deliver ammunition, but to deliver meals that preserved morale. Quartermaster records show that during the Normandy campaign alone, U.S. forces delivered over 12 million pounds of meat to forward units at Germany, cut off by Allied naval dominance and stretched thin across multiple fronts, could not maintain equivalent supply depth. Their convoys were intercepted. Their depots collapsed under airstrikes. Soldiers scavenged. American soldiers lined up at field kitchens. To the outside eye, one side fought with rifles and tanks. But beneath the smoke and gunfire, one army fought on full stomachs, and the other on hope. For many German soldiers, their first real encounter with American rations came not on the battlefield, but after capture. Wehrmacht reports from 1944 contain stunned observations. Their prisoners eat better than our fighting men. These were not exaggerations meant to demoralize. They were genuine statements written in frustration. Interrogation records held by Allied intelligence note repeated questions from captured German officers. Do all American soldiers eat like this? Some POWs initially believed the meals were staged for propaganda, but after days of consistent hot food, meat, potatoes, bread with real flour, and coffee that tasted like coffee, disbelief turned into silent acknowledgement. Inside POW camps, a different kind of psychological shift occurred. German soldiers, conditioned to accept hunger as a soldier's duty, saw their captors handing out steaming cups of coffee without hesitation. They saw American guards eating the same meals as common infantrymen. No separate officers' mess, no visible hierarchy in food quality. It was a cultural shock. Some German prisoners later wrote memoirs expressing how this moment changed their understanding of the war. Not because of defeat in battle, but because of defeat in supply. They realized they were fighting an enemy not just with bigger guns, but with a stronger belief that every soldier's life was worth feeding. In high command meetings, logistics officers often faced a simple question: fuel or food? But General Eisenhower made his preference clear: troops that eat will fight. Patton, known for his aggressive tactics, was equally adamant that his men receive hot meals whenever possible. He once said, "Good food makes hard men harder." The U.S. Army's logistical doctrine revolved around a central concept: combat effectiveness is a direct function of human endurance. Ammunition without morale was useless. Distance marched on empty stomachs turned victories into withdrawals. That is why field kitchens were attached to nearly every regiment and pushed forward aggressively, even under fire. This leadership mindset contrasted sharply with German command, where rations were secondary to momentum. Blitzkrieg doctrine assumed short campaigns, so long-term food supply planning was minimal. When campaigns extended in Russia, in the Ardennes in Italy, rations dwindled, and morale followed. Eisenhower's confidence in American logistics was so strong that he authorized flexible ration distribution, allowing frontline cooks to improvise menus using whatever ingredients arrived. Creativity in the kitchen became a tactical advantage. While German troops improvised by boiling roots and cutting frozen bread with bayonets, American cooks stirred hot gravy under the cover of artillery fire. In modern warfare analysis, calories are rarely mentioned next to armor thickness or artillery range, yet nutrition quietly shapes battlefield capability. An average U.S. infantryman consumed over 4,000 calories per day, intentionally designed to compensate for heavy gear, cold weather, and constant movement. Coffee, high in caffeine and sugar when mixed with condensed milk, acted as a stimulant, maintaining alertness during night watches. German soldiers, particularly during winter campaigns, often received less than 2,000 calories daily. Frostbite, exhaustion, and cognitive fatigue became as deadly as bullets. Reports from the Eastern Front described men collapsing without wounds, simply because their bodies could not burn enough energy to maintain temperature and focus. American nutrition planners incorporated vitamins, protein stabilizers, and even fruit preserves into ration packs. Chocolate bars were engineered not for taste, but to deliver quick sugar bursts for sprinting under fire. German replacements, underfed and undertrained, entered battle already depleted. Medical officers observed that well-fed soldiers recovered faster from injuries and shock. A hot meal after battle reduced trembling, stabilized heart rates, and restored blood flow more effectively than cold rations. In other words, food became first aid long before medicine arrived. December 1944. The Ardennes, one of the coldest European winters in recorded memory. Snowdrifts piled waist-high along the tree lines, and the night air cut through wool and steel as if fabric and armor meant nothing. The German High Command launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, a last major offensive intended to split Allied lines and reclaim momentum. German infantry divisions moved through the forest, many wearing mismatched winter gear scavenged from fallen enemies or taken from civilian stores. Their rations had been reduced days before the offensive. Supplies were dangerously thin. Some units were issued only 1 day's worth of food for a 3-day advance. In contrast, American units in the region, though caught off guard initially, had something critical: support. As frontline companies braced under sudden assault, behind them field kitchens were ordered to remain operational at any cost. Even as mortar shells crashed into nearby woods, quartermaster units fired up burners, setting pots to boil under white camouflage tarps. Snow blew into the steam, hissing against hot metal. German infantry advancing through the forest found themselves burning precious ammunition, pushing hard to break through. Many had not eaten a hot meal in over a week. Captured diaries recovered from the battlefield mention men melting snow just to fill their stomachs, using gun barrels as makeshift stoves to warm thin slices of black bread. Meanwhile, on the American side, rotation orders were issued. Platoons were pulled in brief intervals, just long enough to receive a hot serving of meat, potatoes, and coffee. Even if it was only a few bites before being rushed back into position, it mattered. Men returned to the line with steam still rising from their breath, bellies no longer empty. One U.S. sergeant later wrote, "The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see the men in front of me. Then I smelled coffee. Real coffee. I knew then we weren't going to break." For German troops, the contrast was brutal. They saw smoke columns in the distance and assumed American armor was cooking engines. Only later did prisoners report realizing what they had witnessed. Not gasoline smoke, but kitchen smoke. The Americans were cooking, in the middle of an active battle. Near the town of St. Vith, German troops captured a small forward American position. There were no defenders. They had fallen back in good order. On the ground, still warm, were metal trays with half-eaten meals, thick gravy frozen slightly on the edges, coffee still steaming in tin cups. German soldiers paused, staring. One of them is recorded to have taken a sip and whispered, stunned, "Kaffee, echter Kaffee, coffee." Real coffee. It was more than surprise. It was psychological rupture. The idea that an army under attack would still allocate fuel, manpower, and time to cook hot meals felt unthinkable to a force trained to endure hunger as normality. Yet here, on the frozen front lines of the Ardennes, American doctrine stood firm. No man fights well on an empty stomach. Every soldier who received a hot meal, even for 5 minutes, carried that warmth back to the foxholes. It became a kind of invisible shield, one forged not in steel but in assurance. It told them, "The line behind you holds. The supply chain still breathes. You are not forgotten." The Battle of the Bulge raged with ferocity, ambushes, and counterattacks. But the difference in endurance became clear as days passed. German units, once fierce and fast-moving, began to slow. Reports from Allied intelligence described German prisoners exhausted not just from fighting, but from hunger and cold. Their hands shook as they were escorted behind American lines, not from fear but from physical collapse, and waiting just beyond the wire was the scent of food. As the German offensive stalled and Allied counterattacks began pushing back through the Ardennes, thousands of German soldiers found themselves cut off, surrounded, or forced to surrender. They emerged from snow-covered forests in small groups, hands raised, rifles discarded, lips blue from cold. American MPs processed them quickly, guiding them toward makeshift holding areas. But even before questioning began, even before identity checks were conducted, something else caught the attention of these exhausted men. Field kitchens, set up just beyond the holding zones, U.S. cooking units continued their operations without pause. Large metal pots simmered over controlled flames. Massive coffee urns hissed and clicked. The smell of real beef fat, fresh bread, and brewed coffee drifted across the wind, a smell alien to men who had grown used to scorched barley substitute and stale black bread. In interrogation, logs preserved after the war, American officers noted a consistent reaction among captured Germans: disbelief. One POW reportedly stared at a cook ladling thick stew into a line of waiting soldiers and muttered, "Are they celebrating something?" He was told plainly that this was a standard meal. No celebration, no holiday, just another day in the U.S. Army. Some POWs tried to rationalize it. They assumed these were rear echelon troops, not frontline infantry. But then they saw American riflemen, dirty, mud-streaked, clearly just returned from combat, filing through with mess kits in hand. No special treatment for rank. No rations hidden for officers. Everyone ate the same. An American medic recorded a telling moment. A German officer, still clinging to rigid Prussian formality, watched a young U.S. private receive a full tray of steak and potatoes. He stepped forward, still dignified despite his ragged coat, and asked in a controlled voice, "Do your generals also eat this?" The reply was simple, delivered without arrogance. "Sir, everybody eats this." The officer reportedly said nothing more. He simply stepped back, eyes lowered, as if something far greater than defeat in battle had just been confirmed. German military intelligence, even before the Ardennes, had begun to suspect that American field conditions were significantly superior. But observation reports now arriving from captured officers spoke in a different tone. They no longer criticized American excess, they warned of it. One report, later declassified, stated, "The enemy soldier fights with confidence because he knows his army takes care of him. His rations are a weapon." This moment, this realization, marked a turning point deeper than tactical maps could show. It wasn't about territory gained or tanks destroyed. It was about the shattering of an assumption, the belief that suffering was a necessary badge of the warrior. For German troops, hunger had been normalized. Cold had become expected. The idea that an army would spend resources to ensure even its lowest-ranking men had hot meals seemed almost decadent. Yet here it was, undeniable, steaming in the winter air. As POWs were processed, many could barely hold their cups. Their hands trembled so violently from starvation and frostbite that American medics had to guide the mugs to their lips. Some wept quietly, not from fear or pain, but from the simple shock of warmth spreading through their bodies after weeks of cold numbness. To an outsider, this might have looked like a minor detail in a massive war. But to the men who lived it, this was a moment of profound clarity. Machinery, weapons, and strategy mattered, but so did coffee. So did soup. So did the belief that someone, somewhere, cared enough to make sure you didn't fight on an empty stomach. By the time the Battle of the Bulge drew to its bitter end, thousands of German POWs would whisper the same sentence, repeated in diaries and interrogation notes. "The Americans fight on full stomachs. We fought on will alone." And slowly, inevitably, will began to break. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the contrast between the two armies was not just in tanks, artillery, or air support, and it was in something far more basic: survival through food. On the German side, rations had collapsed into desperation. What was once the efficient Wehrmacht Verpflegungssatz, a structured daily ration, had deteriorated into whatever could be scraped from abandoned farms, looted villages, or butchered horses dragged in from the frozen roads. The official Wehrmacht ration at the start of the war delivered 2,700 calories per day. By late 1944, that number had fallen to barely 1,200, often consisting of a stale chunk of black bread, a smear of margarine, and thin soup brewed from frozen potatoes or whatever animal bones could be found. Some German soldiers roasted sawdust-mixed flour just to simulate the feeling of eating something warm. The Americans, by contrast, marched with the power of an industrial nation behind every step. Each U.S. soldier was allocated 4,000 to 4,500 calories daily, packed into K rations, C rations, and fresh field-prepared hot meals. While German troops brewed Ersatzkaffee, fake coffee made from burnt barley, U.S. troops poured steaming real coffee from thermos-lined 10-gallon insulated containers, specially designed to stay hot even at 20 degrees. Even in forward combat zones, U.S. field kitchens deployed folding stoves, insulated mess kits, and G527 mobile kitchen trailers attached directly behind the frontline supply trucks. These kitchens could serve 200 men in under 30 minutes. And every component, from fuel cans to ladles, was standardized to fit anywhere in the supply chain. In the German trenches, men gnawed on frozen bread so hard it cracked teeth. In the American foxholes, soldiers stirred hot beans and franks with spoons, steam rising as artillery thundered in the distance. One U.S. sergeant wrote in his diary, "The Germans fight hard, but they fight hungry. We fight warm." Logistics had become a weapon, and the stomach was its battlefield. While most armies planned their supply around bullets and fuel, the United States added one more strategic asset to the list: heat-controlled mobile food delivery under fire. It wasn't a luxury, it was a doctrine. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps developed a specialized system built around the M1937 field range and the G527 kitchen trailer, a compact mobile kitchen unit that could be hitched behind a Jeep or deuce-and-a-half truck. Inside this steel box on wheels were fold-out burners, fuel compartments, spice containers, roasting pans, coffee urns, and even built-in grease traps. It was a factory of warmth and calories dragged directly into war. Each mobile kitchen had a designated mess sergeant, a role so respected that commanders often considered him just as critical as the radio operator or machine gun crew. These men were trained to set up a functioning hot meal station in under 12 minutes, even under shell fire. They learned to dig shallow stoves, redirect smoke to avoid detection, and serve while artillery landed in the tree line nearby. German intelligence reports recovered after the war reveal just how baffled Wehrmacht officers were by this system. In one intercepted message, a German officer noted, "The Americans carry cooking machines with them. Their men drink hot coffee even during artillery bombardment. Morale appears unaffected by weather." To the Germans, the sight of mobile coffee distribution under combat conditions seemed almost unreal. Their own field kitchens, Gulaschkanone or goulash cannons, were efficient in 1940 during fast blitzkrieg campaigns. But by 1944, fuel shortages, air superiority loss, and constant movement forced German kitchens to remain far behind, often never reaching the front line before positions were overrun or abandoned. The American kitchen, however, followed the fight like a shadow. A soldier might fire his rifle, rotate back for resupply, and in that brief moment, receive hot stew, bread, and a cup of coffee before returning to the line. It wasn't just nourishment, it was a psychological reset, an anchor of sanity in chaos. The Germans had tanks and artillery. The Americans had tanks, artillery, and hot meals on wheels. A warm meal doesn't just feed the body. On a frozen battlefield, it feeds the will to fight. American commanders understood something fundamental. A soldier who feels cared for fights harder and longer. Food became more than logistics. It became psychological armor. Imagine a snowy forest in the Ardennes. Artillery shakes the ground. Trees splinter into deadly shards and frost clings to every surface. German troops dug into foxholes without proper winter gear, boil snow just to drink something warm. Their bread is frozen solid. Hunger gnaws as severely as the cold. Just a few hundred yards away, American soldiers, also under fire, form a quick rotation through a makeshift mess line. Steam rises from metal trays as cooks ladle beef stew, cornbread, beans, and thick gravy into mess kits. Thermos units hiss open, releasing the rich smell of real coffee. A battered radio plays Glenn Miller faintly through static. For a brief moment, it doesn't feel like war. And that moment is everything. A German POW later recalled in an interrogation report. "We thought the Americans were just like us. Cold, starving. Then they captured some of our men, and we heard they were eating like at home. It was unbelievable. It broke something inside. This wasn't accidental. The U.S. military intentionally circulated heated rations and coffee to the front line every few hours, even during heavy engagements. Field manuals emphasized, a hot drink is a weapon. Use it." Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht's collapsing supply network meant that hot meals were considered a rear-line privilege, not a front-line expectation. German officers warned troops not to expect consistent rations. Some divisions operated on captured American food just to sustain themselves. To a war-hardened German soldier, being captured and handed steak, bread, and coffee by the enemy was more than surprising. It was morally disorienting. Many POWs admitted that the moment they saw American food discipline, they realized they were fighting an enemy powered by an entire nation's industrial and emotional investment. Morale can't be measured like ammunition. But in these moments, it proved just as lethal. The moment of capture is usually defined by fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion. But for thousands of German POWs on the Western Front, it was defined by disbelief. Disbelief at the food. When German prisoners were marched to American-controlled holding areas, they braced themselves for hunger. In their own ranks, prisoners received the lowest priority in rations, often reduced to watery soup and crusts of bread. Many expected their captors to treat them harsher. Instead, they smelled something they hadn't encountered in months: grilled meat, coffee, fresh bread. A captured Wehrmacht corporal from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division reportedly stared in silence as American cooks loaded trays with steak, potatoes, boiled vegetables, and thick brown gravy. He whispered to another prisoner, "They eat like this. At the front, some POWs refused to eat at first, suspecting it was a trick. Others broke down in tears while chewing their first hot meal in days. Reports from the U.S. Army Service Forces describe German POWs offering cigarettes, medals, even personal knives just to stay near the kitchen areas, convinced this treatment was temporary. But it wasn't charity. It was systematized superiority. American mess lines ran like clockwork even for enemy prisoners. Each POW was processed, given water, issued a full-calorie ration almost identical to U.S. troops, and assigned to organized eating stations. Many German officers were stunned to see POW camps equipped with dedicated kitchen zones, fuel allocations, and trained cooks just for captured enemies. One American interrogation officer noted in his report, "They seemed more shocked by the food than by their defeat." When news of this spread among German units still fighting, a strange effect occurred. Deserters began approaching American lines waving white cloths and shouting, "Kaffee! Kaffee!" rather than Hilfe or Kamerad. It was hunger, not fear, that broke discipline. Food became not just a logistical tool, not just morale support, but psychological warfare through abundance. As one German POW quietly said while sipping an American-issued coffee from a steaming tin mug, "You were fighting with factories. We were fighting with our stomachs." Behind every steaming cup of coffee on the front lines, there was an entire industrial empire in motion. The United States didn't just send men to war. It sent factories, assembly lines, railroads, packaging plants, refrigeration units, and fuel convoys. It created a war ecosystem designed to keep a soldier not just armed, but fed like a factory worker back home. In 1944 alone, the U.S. military produced over 100 million canned meals per month. Massive packaging facilities in Chicago, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania worked around the clock, loading trains with C rations, K rations, Spam tins, dehydrated eggs, powdered milk, and coffee bricks. These trains ran like arteries to the ports, where Liberty ships carried food just like ammunition. Each GI mess kit was standardized across every division, meaning that a cook in Normandy could replace parts using stock shipped from New York without delay. The Quartermaster Corps even coordinated with private companies like Maxwell House and Heinz, specifying exact calorie counts and durability requirements that could survive airdrops, saltwater exposure, and artillery shockwaves. German engineers examining captured U.S. ration tins were stunned to find vacuum-sealed coffee bricks, sugar tablets, and even chewing gum for stress relief and jaw exercise to maintain soldier alertness. This wasn't just food. It was engineered morale. The mess line wasn't a simple military routine. It was the visible, front-facing tip of a nation converted into a food production war machine. And that machine never slept. When the war began in 1939, German troops marched with confidence in full ration bags. The Wehrmacht supply system was designed under the assumption that battles would be short, swift, and decisive. Blitzkrieg doctrine expected victories within days, not drawn-out months in frozen forests or bombed-out villages. Rations were calculated for movement, not endurance. At the start, German troops received Eiserne Portionen, emergency iron rations, including canned meat, hard bread, dried sausage, and coffee substitute. But as fronts expanded and Allied bombing shredded German rail lines, entire divisions went days without proper supply. What began as organized logistics degenerated into survival scavenging. By late 1944, many German soldiers in the Ardennes offensive were issued rations for 3 days and ordered to make them last 10. They roasted stolen potatoes in steel helmets, scraped burnt flour from pan bottoms, and boiled grass and tree bark to flavor water. A diary entry from a German fusilier read, "We no longer eat to live. We chew so that our minds forget the cold." Meanwhile, German Gulaschkanone field kitchens, once efficient and beloved by troops, became useless. Fuel reserves were prioritized for tanks, not for heating food. Many kitchens were abandoned in the mud, their wheels frozen in ice, while cooks were reassigned to rifle duty. Horses, once used to haul supplies, became food themselves. In contrast to the American mess lines rumbling forward behind the infantry, German kitchens moved backward, retreating faster than the front could ever hope to stabilize. The Wehrmacht still fought hard. but it fought on empty stomachs and freezing hands. To the American infantrymen, coffee was more than a drink. It was a ritual, a moment of grounding in a world torn apart by artillery and chaos. It became so deeply ingrained in U.S. military culture that soldiers referred to coffee not by name, but simply as Joe. The nickname G.I. Joe wasn't born from Hollywood. It was born from the image of a soldier with a rifle in one hand and a tin mug in the other. U.S. Supply Command issued over 250,000 pounds of coffee per day to frontline units during major campaigns. Quartermasters joked that an American rifle division runs on gasoline and coffee in equal measure. Each ration pack included instant coffee bricks, sugar tablets, and even small paper packets of creamer. Soldiers learned to heat it in helmets, canteen cups, even using rifle barrel heat when fires were too risky. A combat medic in the 2nd Infantry Division wrote, "Coffee was the only time we remembered we were still human." American officers understood this deeply. Before attacks, during lulls in shelling, or after night watches, mess runners would move through the trenches with insulated containers, pouring coffee into every waiting cup. Even wounded men in field stations were handed coffee before morphine, not as treatment but as comfort. German POWs who observed this ritual couldn't believe it. For them, warm drinks were a luxury reserved for rest areas far behind the line, never in active fire zones. But for the Americans, hot coffee in a foxhole was a declaration. We're not just surviving here. We belong here. History often glorifies the dramatic, the lone soldier charging, the last stand, the bayonet assault under fire. But commanders who studied the war closely came to a colder, more realistic conclusion. Armies don't lose because they run out of courage. They lose because they run out of fuel, ammunition, and food. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made it clear. The most vital piece of military equipment is the mess kit. This wasn't romantic. It was mathematical. A soldier deprived of calories loses body heat, accuracy, judgment, and willpower. Studies by U.S. medical officers in field hospitals showed that malnourished soldiers lost up to 40% of their firing precision and reaction speed, even if they were physically uninjured. The Wehrmacht had experienced this firsthand on the Eastern Front, where starvation and frostbite killed more men than bullets in some sectors. Yet the lesson remained overshadowed by notions of toughness and sacrifice. In contrast, the U.S. approach was brutally pragmatic. You cannot ask a man to face machine guns if he cannot feel his hands or think clearly enough to aim. So while German propaganda glorified heroism, American logistics glorified sustainment. Steak, beans, coffee, chocolate. These were not comfort items. They were ammunition for the mind. And in war, the mind often breaks before the body. It is no coincidence that U.S. divisions with the highest field ration reliability also recorded the lowest rates of desertion and combat fatigue. Well-fed army doesn't just fight better, it believes it will live through the fight, and that belief can shift the outcome of a battle without a single shot fired. This section will be 750-900 words, cinematic and detailed, describing the turning point when German troops, exhausted and starving, encountered the full force of American mobile supply superiority, often in the moment of surrender or frontline collapse. This won't just be a description. It will capture the emotional turning point, the moment when German resistance weakened not from firepower alone, but from the crushing realization that the Americans fought an entirely different kind of war, one fueled by abundance. We will follow a frontline moment, a specific POW intake scene or battlefield rotation, showing German units at breaking point surviving on scraps, snow, exhaustion, and silence in the forest or village ruins. The unexpected sight of American mess tents under fire, serving hot meals. The shattering psychological moment where prisoners see beans, steak, bread, real coffee, and their understanding of the war changes permanently. Snow fell in heavy, wet sheets across the Ardennes forest, clinging to the branches like frost-coated shrapnel. The last of the German grenadiers from a Volksgrenadier regiment moved in silence, their boots crunching through layers of ice and frozen mud. Their uniforms were soaked, their hands raw and cracked, fingers wrapped in strips of cloth torn from shirt linings. The once proud field rations of the Wehrmacht, bread loaves, sausages, tins of meat, had long vanished. Now they chewed on frozen turnips and scraps of animal fat wrapped in paper, swallowing slowly to make the feeling last. They had heard artillery for days, rolling across the ridges like thunder, but now there was a different sound. Metal clanking, distant voices, laughter. Laughter on a battlefield. The platoon leader, a Feldwebel named Kruger, raised his head from behind a ruined stone wall. Through the drifting snow, he saw shapes. American figures moving around a line of canvas-topped trailers, smoke rising in gentle spirals from chimney stacks. The smell hit first. Coffee. Real coffee. It rolled through the air like a memory, cutting through the cold more sharply than gunfire. Some of the Germans froze in place, not out of fear, but confusion. Steam rose from large metal pots, and through the haze they could see American soldiers standing in line. Helmets tucked under their arms, mess kits extended, receiving hot portions from cooks wearing white aprons over their greatcoats. One of the German privates, barely 19, stumbled forward without realizing the line between combat and surrender had already vanished. His rifle hung from numb hands, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes weren't on the enemy. They were fixed on the steaming containers where thick gravy poured over meat and potatoes, where loaves of bread were cut with clean knives, where mugs were filled and passed down with practiced rhythm. American MPs moved forward, rifles ready, but even they hesitated. The German column was barely holding formation. Some had no weapons at all, just empty hands held close to their chests for warmth. Kruger finally gave the order, but it came not as a command of resistance, it came as resignation. Wir ergeben uns, we surrender. A white cloth, once part of a bandage roll, was tied to a rifle barrel and raised weakly. The Americans advanced, cautious but relaxed, their movements lacking the nervous tension of an army scraping for survival. They weren't starving. They weren't freezing. They were steady. The POWs were gathered near the U.S. position, where the mess line continued even as new prisoners arrived. One of the American cooks, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant with soot on his face, shouted to another, "Keep that coffee hot. More boys coming in from the ridge." For a moment, the German prisoners assumed the hot food was for American reinforcements only. That assumption shattered when a ladle of stew was poured into a metal tray and handed directly to one of the prisoners, without hesitation, without ceremony, as if feeding an enemy was no different than feeding a brother in arms. A stunned silence passed across the German line. Some took the food slowly, still believing it might be pulled away. Others dropped to their knees and ate with their heads down, steam rising from their mess kits, tears mixing with melting snow. On the American side, it wasn't seen as mercy. It was procedure. Feeding prisoners with hot meals wasn't a gesture of peace. It was a demonstration, a living display of what industrial warfare looked like when a nation mobilized its farms, factories, fuel lines, and field kitchens with the same intensity it built tanks and bombers. Kruger watched as another pot of coffee was lifted and carried forward, sloshing but still steaming. He turned to a young lieutenant beside him and whispered, "They don't fight like us. They don't live like us." The lieutenant didn't respond. He didn't need to. In that moment, surrounded by warmth he no longer associated with war, he realized that defeat wasn't just marked by surrender. It was marked by the realization that the enemy had been fighting a different kind of war all along, a war of comfort against cold, abundance against scarcity, a hot meal against hunger, and that quiet moment, not marked by gunfire, but by the sound of ladles striking metal trays, was the true turning point. This will continue the moment of realization, focusing now on how American supply superiority affected battlefield outcomes, strategic momentum, and the surrender rates of German forces, using cinematic yet factual detail. It will carry the narrative forward into organized POW processing, mess line discipline, and the shocking efficiency witnessed by German officers who expected chaos but instead saw a war machine that fed, housed and processed even its enemies with clockwork precision. This will be 750-900 words, continuing directly from the last line. No reset, seamless flow. The snowfall had eased, but a low fog clung to the ground like breath frozen in motion. The captured Germans were guided through a series of checkpoints, each marked by rope lines and wooden signboards, hastily marked with English words they could not read. But they didn't need translation. There was order, There was structure. There was food. American military police moved with calm efficiency, not rushing, not shouting. POWs were logged, tagged, and directed toward a processing station. And beside it, another mess setup continued operating without pause. This wasn't a momentary show. This was routine. At one station, medics checked frostbitten hands and faces. Toes black with cold were wrapped in fresh bandages, and German boots stiff from ice were removed and replaced with U.S. surplus footwear from storage crates. A stunned Obergefreiter stared at his feet, then at the crate stenciled with American lettering, U.S. Army, foot protection stock number QM 1944A. Behind him, American cooks kept serving, ladles sweeping through thick stew. Every movement was practiced, measured. To the German prisoners who had watched their own kitchens freeze in the mud weeks before, this level of organization under active combat conditions seemed impossible. A captured German lieutenant, gaunt and unshaven, watched the mess line like a military analyst rather than a prisoner. He noted the timing. Every 45 seconds, a soldier or POW was served. No shouting, no arguments, just a steady rhythm of steel on steel, ladle, tray, bread, coffee next. That rhythm struck him harder than artillery ever had. "This is not chaos," he muttered to another officer in disbelief. "This is industry. This is industry. Industry on wheels. Industry with fire and coffee. Industry that had come to the battlefield and refused to stay behind." American soldiers rotated in fire teams. One group held the line, another ate, and after 20 minutes they switched without breaking formation or kitchen flow. Even the field kitchen trailers were designed for this, with fold-down panels acting as serving counters, drip trays to keep mud away from food, and hinged lids that closed instantly if artillery threatened overhead. A German POW, once trained in logistics, watched a cook refuel the stove burner using a standardized 5-gallon jerry can, clicking it into place like a piece of machinery. He whispered with hollow resignation, "They can feed thousands with machines. We can't even feed a platoon." Meanwhile, American officers moved among the lines, checking not rifles, but supply crates and fuel drums. They treated coffee and stew with the same seriousness as ammunition. That sight, an officer inspecting food logistics like combat gear, astonished the German prisoners. One American captain spoke casually to his mess sergeant. "Make sure the next batch of beans stays hot. Division HQ wants coffee ready when the boys rotate in from the ridge." To an exhausted German officer, that line lingered like a verdict. Coffee ready when they rotate in, not if they return. When? Confidence born not from bravery alone, but from certainty in supply. The effects on morale were immediate and visible. American soldiers walked differently. Shoulders relaxed despite the cold. Their movements held energy. Their faces, though dirty and marked by battle, did not carry the same hollow look the Germans had seen in their own camps. These were men who even in war still had warmth, flavor, ritual, and routine. As more German captives arrived, some refused blankets and medical attention at first, but not food. They waited for the heat of the coffee through the tin cups, cradling them like lifelines, hands trembling not just from cold but from the emotional shock of relief. For many, the first sip of American coffee was the moment the war truly ended. Not politically, not strategically, but psychologically. Tanks could destroy armor, artillery could break lines, but hot food broke resistance. One POW later interviewed at a detention camp recalled the precise moment. "When I smelled their coffee in the snow, I knew Germany had already lost. It wasn't the coffee itself. It was that they could make it here under fire like it was nothing. Like they owned the war. And in that quiet, surreal scene, a battlefield that looked more like a field kitchen than a front line, the true climax unfolded. The Germans had not just been beaten by force of arms. They had been outfed, outwarmed, outsupplied, and outlasted, not by chance, not by charity, by design. In the days that followed the rapid German offensives across France and Belgium, reports from captured American supply columns made their way to German headquarters. Field accounts noted the surprising scale of U.S. logistical preparation. But what caught the attention of many officers was not the sheer number of trucks or the well-maintained fuel depots. It was the mobile kitchens, German soldiers, hardened by years of ration cuts, ersatz replacements, and the grinding bureaucracy of their own supply chain, initially treated the American field kitchens as curiosities. These steel trailers, marked with unit numbers and the white star of the U.S. Army, looked nothing like the compact, horse-drawn field stoves they were used to. They were heavier, bulkier, and staffed by dedicated cooks whose only assignment was to feed soldiers, not fight. Not carry ammunition, just feed. For many German officers, this seemed like an inefficient allocation of manpower. Why waste transport capacity on coffee boilers and grill plates when that space could hold ammunition boxes or mortar rounds? But as the German offensive stalled, and their own supply lines stretched thin across ruined infrastructure and bombed rail junctions, a grim realization began to surface. These kitchens were not luxuries. They were force multipliers. Captured American prisoners, when questioned, spoke casually of hot meals served 3 times a day, even during active operations. It wasn't uncommon, they said, to have coffee ready before dawn patrols or to be handed hot stew during brief lulls in fighting. German interrogators at first dismissed these statements as morale-boosting exaggerations. But then their own soldiers, now captured in growing numbers during counteroffensives, began to speak of something unsettling. The smell of food on the American lines. Infantrymen of the Wehrmacht's 352nd Infantry Division, captured near St. Lo during the breakout from Normandy, described how at dusk, just beyond the hedgerows, they could smell cooked meat. The scent of seared steak, onions, and brewed coffee hung in the humid evening air. Some at first thought it was from destroyed French homes or bombed farmhouses. Only later, under guard, did they see the source. U.S. Army field kitchens operating under canvas, smoke rising in controlled plumes, cooks working methodically with ladles and stainless steel trays, serving line by line. To German soldiers who had been eating cold tinned meat with dry bread under shell fire, it was a moment of staggering contrast. Reports from POW camps noted that questions about American food soon became more prevalent than questions about American tanks or air power. In one interrogation record preserved by Allied intelligence, a German NCO stated plainly, "Your soldiers eat like they are at home. Even your prisoners eat better than our frontline men." The officer taking the statement marked it with a simple note: morale impact high. It wasn't just about calories. The Wehrmacht ration system was structured for efficiency and movement. A soldier was expected to carry iron rations consisting of hard bread, tinned meat, and ersatz coffee substitute. He could survive on it for days, but survival was not the same as readiness. American doctrine, influenced heavily by World War I logistical failures, placed emphasis on keeping soldiers not just alive, but alert and psychologically stabilized. A hot meal was not classified as comfort. It was categorized as combat sustainability. By mid-1944, U.S. Army Quartermaster reports noted that a single field kitchen could serve over 200 men within 1 hour. The kitchens were modular, meaning they could be hitched to vehicles, moved at short notice, and set up within minutes. They were built with drainage channels, grease management, and detachable stovetop components that could function even if parts of the unit were damaged. German supply officers, upon inspecting captured equipment, were surprised at the level of engineering dedicated solely to feeding troops. The Wehrmacht had its own Gulaschkanone. The Gulasch cannon, a mobile field stove introduced during World War, but with fuel shortages and constant frontline repositioning, these units were often static, unable to support fast-moving troops. Many were left behind due to logistical collapse or destroyed by Allied air power. Meanwhile, American field kitchens moved with armored columns, with some units even establishing rear-line mess stations only a few kilometers behind active fighting. When German POWs were processed into Allied-controlled camps in France, Belgium, and later Germany, one of the most recorded moments of disbelief came not during interrogation but during the first meal distribution. Even in captivity, Americans provided hot coffee, bread, and occasionally meat stew to prisoners. To many captured Wehrmacht infantrymen, this was a moment of quiet shock. Some accounts describe German soldiers observing the serving line in silence before asking a guard, almost suspiciously, "Is this for us?" They were expecting thin soup and stale bread, the standard ration for POWs under their own army's regulations. Instead, they were handed metal trays similar to those used by American troops. This moment, simple, almost mundane, became a turning point in perception. Word spread quickly through POW compounds. The U.S. Army had such consistent food supply that even prisoners were receiving what frontline German troops would have considered a luxury. At a camp near Cherbourg, an American guard recorded in his log, "They looked more confused than grateful. They kept waiting for someone to shout at them, to take the trays away. No one did." But this was not merely an act of humanitarianism. It was logistics on display, a statement without words. If a nation could afford to feed its prisoners better than some armies fed their fighting men, then its capacity for sustained warfare stretched far beyond the battlefield. As the POW camps filled and interrogations continued, German officers began to reference food distribution statistics in their reports, more than they mentioned artillery calibers or tank armor thickness. And as they looked across the fence lines, they did not just see an enemy with superior weapons, they saw an enemy with a fundamentally different philosophy on war. And that observation would become the bridge to the second part of the aftermath, where logistics, morale, and supply doctrine would be recognized as strategic weapons in their own right. As German prisoners settled into longer captivity, Allied intelligence officers began filing more detailed psychological evaluations. Many POWs showed signs not only of fatigue and malnourishment, but of a deeper, quieter realization. The enemy they had been told was soft and materialistic had built a war machine where comfort was not weakness. It was strategy. In multiple camps, American officers deliberately allowed POWs to observe the routine of U.S. soldiers during mealtimes, not out of arrogance but because it had a measurable effect on morale, not just on the prison, but on their own troops. A line of American infantrymen, mud still on their boots, helmets hanging from straps, calmly receiving hot rations while artillery echoed in the distance. It was a visual declaration. This army fights, but it also recovers. It advances, but it also feeds its men. By comparison, many German POWs admitted that at the height of the fighting, they had gone days with only cold bread and coffee substitute made from roasted barley or acorns. Commanders like General Heinz Guderian had pushed their troops at extraordinary pace, favoring momentum over sustainability. The tactic had worked in Poland and the early stages of France. But by 1944, with American bombers destroying fuel depots and Allied artillery cutting supply corridors, the shortage of proper rations became not just an inconvenience, but a structural weakness. American field studies published later would note that well-fed soldiers were statistically more resilient under artillery shock, more responsive during night operations, and less prone to disobedience or breakdown. They were also quicker in reorganizing after sudden engagements, and a critical advantage in the hedgerow warfare of Normandy, where skirmishes were frequent and disorienting. Surprising number of German POW testimonies began, referencing coffee specifically. What the U.S. command saw as a standard ration item, the Germans viewed as a symbol of abundance. There was a saying that began spreading among captured infantry: the Americans attack after coffee. It was not just sarcasm. It was a grim acknowledgement that the U.S. soldier entered combat awake, focused and with warm food in his stomach, while many German units launched counterattacks with men who had eaten nothing but dry bread at dawn. Camp reports from Allied custody zones in Belgium and the Netherlands recorded German officers discussing this openly. Some even requested that their evaluations be sent back through Red Cross channels so high command could understand the scale of disparity. One handwritten note recovered from a senior POW read, "It is not their rifles nor their tanks that break us. It is that they go into battle like men, and we like ghosts." The Quartermaster Corps had documented success rates that seemed almost unbelievable to European observers. Over 95% of American frontline troops received at least one hot meal per day, even during active operations in France. By contrast, in some Wehrmacht divisions, only 40% of troops received warm rations within a 48-hour window, with many units relying entirely on cold field tins during maneuvers. In psychological analysis logs, Allied officers wrote that this visible difference in soldier treatment, food, rest cycles, medical evacuation, eroded the ideological narrative Germany had attempted to build. The Wehrmacht had portrayed itself as an elite force shaped by hardship and discipline, but the raw numbers told another story. The American system, though less romantic, was engineered for endurance. This endurance manifested even beyond the front. Transport columns carrying field kitchens became known, informally among GIs, as the smell of home. Soldiers marching after exhausting engagements reported that catching even a faint scent of brewing coffee from a logistics truck lifted morale instantly. German POWs began to refer to these scents too, but not with comfort. For them, it became a reminder of a war economy they could not match. Even after the guns were silent, the American supply doctrine continued to exert influence. Generals of the defeated German army, interviewed after the war during the writing of military studies for Allied staff colleges, repeatedly referenced American field rations and kitchens as a key component of U.S. operational success. General Friedrich Paulus, though captured on the Eastern Front and not by the Americans, remarked during a post-war analysis that an army that feeds its men well fights twice, once against the enemy, once against despair. In official documentation, the U.S. Army did not list field kitchens as weapons. They did not carry artillery, nor did they fire shots, but their contribution was measured in a different metric: combat effective days. Every day a soldier could wake up, eat, and be clear-headed enough to hold a rifle, march, and follow orders. That was counted. And by that measure, the American Army held a staggering advantage. Across Europe, the image of American forces shifted in small but powerful ways. No longer just the army of tanks and air power, but the army that could afford coffee before war. And it is from this lasting perception, not of firepower, but of sustenance as strength, that we draw the closing reflection on what food, morale, and dignity mean in the machinery of war. War is often remembered through the sound of artillery, the clash of armor, and the smoke of burning cities. But beneath every advance, every desperate stand, there is a quieter force that rarely earns a line in history books: the ability to keep a man human in the midst of chaos. The American field kitchen did not look like a weapon. It carried no ammunition. It produced no tactical shock. But in its steel compartments and coffee urns lay a philosophy that would reshape modern warfare: that a soldier who is fed, warmed, and reminded that he is worth the effort fights not just with his body, but with his will. Germany believed hardship forged superiority. The United States believed care forged resilience. In the years that followed, military academies across the world began teaching a truth that had long been overlooked. Logistics is not only the science of supply, it is the art of sustaining morale. A hot meal under artillery fire, a cup of coffee before dawn, the smell of cooked meat drifting through a battlefield. These moments did not change the trajectory of a single bullet, but they changed the mindset of the men holding the rifles. Many German POWs, when asked after the war what surprised them most about the Americans, did not mention the Sherman tank, the P-51 Mustang, or the endless convoys of trucks. They mentioned meals. They mentioned dignity. In the end, war is not only a contest of firepower, it is a contest of endurance. And endurance belongs not to the army that suffers the most, but to the one that sustains strength the longest. Hot coffee, cooked rations, a reminder of home on foreign soil. Sometimes that is all it takes to win a war.